Standing in the bitter December wind outside my grandson's house, I clutched the antique music box that had been my mother's, watching warm, golden lights spill from the windows where my family gathered for Christmas Eve dinner. The carved wooden angel on top seemed to mock me as I heard their laughter drift through the glass, laughter that stopped the moment I knocked. When Tommy opened the door, his 12-year-old face twisted with an expression I'd never seen before, cold and rehearsed. "Grandma Rose," he said, not stepping aside to let me in. "We didn't save you a seat." Behind him, I could see the dining room table set for 8 people, with my usual chair at the head conspicuously missing, replaced by a decorative poinsettia. The music box suddenly felt heavier in my hands, its familiar weight now a burden rather than comfort. What I discovered next would change everything I thought I knew about family, loyalty, and the true meaning of Christmas miracles. The shock of Tommy's words hit me like ice water, but I forced myself to smile. "That's okay, sweetheart. I can sit anywhere," I said, stepping forward. But he didn't move from the doorway. His mother, Sarah, appeared behind him, her face flushed from cooking, wearing the apron I'd given her last Christmas. "Rose, we weren't expecting you," she said, though we'd confirmed this dinner 3 days ago when she'd specifically asked me to bring my famous apple pie. The sweet scent of cinnamon and nutmeg drifted past them, and I could hear my son David's booming laugh from the living room. I held up the covered pie dish in my free hand, balancing it with the music box. I brought the apple pie just like we discussed. Sarah's eyes darted nervously toward the living room, then back to me. Actually, David's mother-in-law brought dessert this year. My heart began to race as I realized this wasn't some innocent mix-up. If you're listening to this story and know what it feels like to be pushed aside by family, please share where you're from. I'd love to know I'm not alone. Through the gap between Sarah and Tommy, I caught a glimpse of David's new mother-in-law, Gloria, seated in what had been my chair for 15 years of family gatherings. She wore a crimson velvet dress and pearl necklace, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, looking every inch the wealthy widow she was. David had married his second wife Janet only 6 months ago, and Gloria had made it clear from the beginning that she considered herself the new matriarch of the family. The dining room sparkled with her contribution: expensive crystal glasses, silver candlesticks, and an elaborate centerpiece that must have cost more than my monthly Social Security check. I could see Janet fussing over Gloria, adjusting her napkin and refilling her wine glass with practiced deference. The sight made my stomach churn, but not as much as seeing my own son David nodding along with whatever Gloria was saying, his face animated in a way I hadn't seen him look at me in months. The music box's tiny latch seemed to dig into my palm as I gripped it tighter, wondering how everything had changed so quickly. "Mom, what are you doing here?" David's voice boomed from behind Sarah and Tommy, and he appeared in the entryway, his face flushed from wine and embarrassment. He wore the burgundy sweater I'd knitted him last Christmas, though I noticed he'd removed the small pine tree pin I'd given him to match. Janet materialized at his side, her blonde hair pulled back in an elaborate updo, wearing a black cocktail dress that screamed expensive taste. "David, I told Rose we'd rescheduled," Janet said smoothly, though her eyes held a steely determination I'd learned to recognize. The lie rolled off her tongue so easily that I wondered how many others she'd told. "We decided to keep it small this year, just immediate family." The words "immediate family" hit me like a physical blow. I who had raised David alone after his father died, I who had babysat Tommy every weekend for years, I who had helped with every mortgage payment when David's business was struggling. Gloria's laughter tinkled from the dining room, followed by Tommy's delighted giggle at something she'd said. The sound that used to be reserved for our special moments together now belonged to someone else. The cold December air whipped around my ankles as I stood there, still holding the apple pie that had taken me 4 hours to make. The crust rolled with the same technique my mother had taught me 60 years ago. "David, we spoke on Tuesday," I said, my voice steady despite the trembling in my hands. "You specifically asked if I was bringing the music box to show Gloria, remember?" His face went pale, and I saw Sarah shoot him a sharp look. The music box had been in our family for 4 generations, passed down from mother to daughter-in-law, and I'd been planning to officially give it to Janet tonight as a peace offering. David cleared his throat nervously. "Look, Mom, maybe we can do lunch sometime next week instead." "Next week." As if Christmas Eve dinner was some casual get-together we could reschedule like a dentist appointment. Through the window, I could see Gloria holding court at the dinner table, Tommy hanging on her every word as she showed him something sparkly from her purse. The realization hit me with crystalline clarity. This wasn't about space or scheduling. This was about erasing me entirely from my own family's traditions. Turning away from their guilty faces, I walked slowly back to my 15-year-old Honda Civic, the pie dish growing heavy in my arms. The music box's weight seemed to double with each step, as if it too understood the magnitude of what had just happened. Behind me, I heard the front door close with a soft click that sounded like finality itself. The neighborhood was picture-perfect, with houses draped in twinkling lights and inflatable Santas waving from frost-covered lawns. But all I could see was my own breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. As I reached my car, fumbling for keys with numb fingers, I caught sight of movement in the upstairs window. Tommy, watching me from what used to be his playroom, where we'd spent countless afternoons building Lego castles and reading adventure stories. His face was pressed against the glass, and for a moment I thought I saw regret in his young eyes. Then the curtain fell, and I was alone with the terrible silence of rejection and the growing certainty that this Christmas Eve would mark the beginning of something I couldn't yet comprehend. Driving home through streets lined with glowing Christmas decorations, I couldn't shake the image of Tommy's face at that window. The music box sat on the passenger seat beside me, its carved angel catching the reflection of passing streetlights. And I found myself remembering the day my mother had given it to me 45 years ago. "Rose," she'd said, "this isn't just a music box. It's a promise that family love endures through everything." The tiny melody it played, "Silent Night," had been the soundtrack to every important moment in our family's history. Christmas mornings, birthdays, graduations, even funerals. I'd wound it up every Christmas Eve for decades, letting its sweet notes fill the house as we gathered around our tree. Tonight, for the first time in 15 years, there would be no family gathering in my living room, no grandchildren sprawled on the carpet opening presents, no son carving the turkey with theatrical flourishes. The empty house waiting for me felt like a tomb, decorated with memories that suddenly seemed as fragile as the music box's delicate mechanism. As I pulled into my driveway, I noticed something that made my heart skip: fresh tire tracks in the snow and a light glowing in my kitchen window. My neighbor Mrs. Chen stood at my kitchen sink, washing dishes that I didn't remember leaving dirty. She turned when I entered, her weathered face creasing into a worried smile. "Rose, dear, I hope you don't mind. I used my spare key when I saw you'd left the coffee pot on." At 78, Margaret Chen was 2 years older than me, but moved with the efficiency of someone half our age. She'd been my neighbor for 23 years, ever since her husband died, and she'd moved into the small bungalow next door. We'd developed an unspoken understanding. She checked on me, I checked on her, and we both pretended it was just neighborly concern rather than the lifeline it had become. "How was dinner at David's?" she asked. But one look at my face told her everything she needed to know. I set the untouched apple pie on the counter and placed the music box carefully beside it, my hands shaking slightly as I released it from my grip. Margaret's sharp eyes took in the scene, the formal dress I'd worn, the carefully styled hair, the pie that hadn't been served. "They didn't let you in," she said quietly, and it wasn't a question. The kindness in Margaret's voice broke something loose inside me, and I found myself telling her everything. The missing chair, Gloria's presence, Janet's lies about rescheduling, Tommy's cold dismissal at the door. Margaret listened without interruption, her hands never pausing in their dishwashing rhythm, her presence somehow making the empty kitchen feel less like a monument to loneliness. When I finished, she dried her hands on the tea towel I'd embroidered with Christmas trees and turned to face me fully. "Rose, in my 78 years, I've learned that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes the people who hurt us most are the ones who are supposed to love us most." She gestured toward the music box, its carved surface gleaming under the overhead light. "But I've also learned that truth has a way of revealing itself when we least expect it." Her words carried a weight that suggested she knew something I didn't, but before I could ask what she meant, she was already reaching for her coat. "Get some sleep, dear. Tomorrow is Christmas Day, and something tells me it's going to be very different than you expect." The cryptic comment lingered in the air long after she'd gone, leaving me alone with the music box and a growing sense that this story was far from over. Sleep eluded me that night, and I found myself sitting at my kitchen table at 2 a.m, staring at the music box by the light of my small Christmas tree. The house felt enormous in its silence, every creak and settle amplified by the absence of the laughter and chaos that usually filled Christmas Eve. I thought about all the years I'd hosted Christmas morning breakfast, how Tommy would race down my stairs in his pajamas, how David would pretend to be too tired for present opening, but secretly loved every moment. The traditions we'd built together seemed as delicate now as spun glass, shattered by forces I still didn't fully understand. When I finally did fall asleep around 4 a.m., slumped over the kitchen table with my head on my arms, I dreamed of music boxes and missing chairs, of grandchildren who looked at me like strangers, and sons who treated me like an inconvenience. The music box sat inches from my face, its silent angel presiding over my restless dreams like a guardian of secrets I hadn't yet learned to decode. Christmas morning dawned gray and bitter, with fresh snow falling steadily outside my windows. I woke with a crick in my neck and the taste of disappointment still sharp on my tongue. The coffee maker gurgled to life as I tried to shake off the lingering sadness of yesterday's rejection. But every familiar Christmas tradition felt hollow now. The stocking I'd hung for myself out of habit, the small pile of gifts I'd wrapped optimistically, thinking I'd have grandchildren to watch open them. The music box seemed to judge me from its place on the table, its carved angel face holding expressions I couldn't quite read. At exactly 9 a.m., my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, and when I answered, a man's professional voice asked, "Mrs. Rose Patterson? This is Detective Martinez with the City Police Department. I'm calling about a complaint filed yesterday evening regarding a family heirloom. Would it be possible for me to stop by this morning?" My heart hammered against my ribs as I agreed to the meeting, wondering what could have possibly prompted police involvement in my family's Christmas Eve disaster. The music box seemed to pulse with hidden significance as I waited for answers that would change everything I thought I knew about loyalty, greed, and the lengths some people will go to for money. Detective Martinez arrived at 10:30, a compact man in his 40s with kind eyes and the patient demeanor of someone accustomed to family disputes. He sat across from me at my kitchen table, declining coffee but accepting a glass of water, his notebook open between us. "Mrs. Patterson, I need to ask you about this music box," he said, gesturing toward the antique piece that had dominated my thoughts for the past 12 hours. "Yesterday evening, a Mrs. Gloria Whitfield called our department claiming that a valuable family heirloom had been stolen from her during a dinner party. She described a 19th century music box with a carved wooden angel valued at approximately $15,000. The number hit me like a physical blow. $15,000? I'd had no idea the music box was worth so much, had always treasured it for sentimental rather than monetary reasons. Detective Martinez studied my face carefully. "Mrs. Whitfield claims the box belongs to her deceased daughter and was taken without permission by someone she described as a bitter former family member seeking revenge." The words hung in the air between us like poison, and I realized that Gloria's manipulation had reached levels I'd never imagined possible. "Detective, this music box has been in my family for 4 generations, I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "My great-grandmother brought it from Germany in 1892. My mother gave it to me on my wedding day, and I have the documentation to prove it." I rose from the table, my legs unsteady but my resolve firm, and retrieved the small wooden box where I kept important papers. Inside were the insurance documents I'd filed after my husband's death, clearly listing the music box with its detailed description and estimated value of $3,000, significantly less than Gloria's claim, but properly documented nonetheless. Detective Martinez examined the papers with professional thoroughness, making notes in his neat handwriting. "Mrs. Patterson, would you mind if I took some photographs of the box and these documents? There seems to be some confusion about ownership, and I want to make sure we have all the facts straight." As he snapped photos with a small digital camera, I felt a growing dread that this was about more than just a music box. Gloria wasn't just trying to steal my family heirloom. She was trying to paint me as a criminal, a vindictive old woman who would stoop to theft out of jealousy and spite. The detective's radio crackled to life as he finished his photography, and I caught fragments of conversation about another call, another family dispute somewhere across town. "Mrs. Patterson, I'm going to be frank with you," he said, closing his notebook and meeting my eyes directly. "Mrs. Whitfield has significant social connections in this community, and her complaint carries weight with my superiors. However, your documentation appears legitimate, and her story has some inconsistencies that concern me." He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "She claims the music box was taken from her home, but she also mentioned it disappeared during a dinner party at her son-in-law's house. Geography aside, there's something about her demeanor that doesn't sit right with me." Hope flickered in my chest like a small flame. "What happens now?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Detective Martinez stood, tucking his notebook into his jacket pocket. "I'm going to visit Mrs. Whitfield and get her side of the story in more detail. In the meantime, I'd recommend you don't handle the music box any more than necessary. This could escalate quickly, and I want to make sure we preserve all evidence." The word evidence sent a chill through me, as I realized my most precious possession had become the center of a potential criminal investigation. After the detective left, I found myself afraid to even look at the music box, as if it had transformed from beloved heirloom into dangerous artifact overnight. The snow continued falling outside my kitchen window, blanketing the world in pristine white that seemed to mock the ugliness growing within my family. I tried to occupy myself with mundane Christmas activities, sorting through old photo albums, organizing recipes I'd collected over the years, but my eyes kept drifting to the music box sitting under what now felt like house arrest. Around noon, Margaret Chen knocked softly on my back door, carrying a plate of homemade cookies and wearing the expression of someone bearing difficult news. "Rose, I couldn't help but notice the police car in your driveway this morning," she said, settling into her usual chair at my table. "And I may have overheard some interesting phone calls through these thin walls." Her admission didn't surprise me. Margaret had always been the neighborhood's unofficial information network, but her knowledge usually centered around harmless gossip about garden disputes and property line disagreements. Today, however, her information would prove far more valuable than either of us could have imagined. "Gloria Whitfield called someone early this morning," Margaret said, her voice low despite my empty house. "I couldn't help but hear her through the bathroom window. She was practically shouting into her phone about making sure the old woman gets what she deserves, and something about teaching David a lesson about loyalty." The words confirmed my worst suspicions about Gloria's motivations, but Margaret wasn't finished. Then, around 10 a.m., she made another call. This one was to someone she called Sweetheart, and she kept saying things like, "Stick to the story," and "Remember, it's worth $15,000. The pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. Gloria hadn't just stolen my place at Christmas dinner. She was orchestrating an elaborate scheme to steal my music box and destroy my reputation in the process. Margaret reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Rose, there's something else. Yesterday afternoon, before your dinner, I saw Gloria at David's house with a large wrapped package. She spent over an hour there, and when she left, she wasn't carrying anything. The implication hung between us like a revelation. Gloria had planted evidence, created a narrative, and turned my own family into unwitting accomplices in her theft of my most precious possession." The afternoon stretched endlessly as I waited for Detective Martinez to return, each minute feeling like an hour as the weight of false accusations pressed down on me. I found myself studying every detail of the music box with new eyes, noting the tiny scratches that recorded decades of careful handling, the slight fading on one side where afternoon sun had touched it through my bedroom window year after year. These weren't just signs of age. They were proof of a life lived in my home, evidence that no amount of Gloria's manipulation could fabricate. Around 3 p.m., my doorbell rang with an urgency that made my heart skip, and I opened the door to find Tommy standing on my porch, his 12-year-old face streaked with tears and his breath coming in visible puffs in the cold air. "Grandma Rose," he gasped, "I need to tell you something important about Gloria and the music box." He looked over his shoulder nervously, as if expecting someone to follow him, then stepped closer to my door. "She brought one just like yours to dinner yesterday, and she was showing it to everyone before you came." His words hit me like lightning, illuminating a truth I hadn't dared to hope for. "She said it was her daughter's, but Grandma Rose, when I touched it, the angel's wing was broken, and yours isn't broken. The boy who had rejected me at the door yesterday had risked everything to bring me this crucial information." I ushered Tommy inside quickly, wrapping him in one of my warm throw blankets while I made him hot chocolate with marshmallows the way he'd loved since he was 6 years old. His story tumbled out between sips of cocoa and shivers that had nothing to do with the December cold. "After you left last night, Gloria kept talking about how some people don't know their place, and how valuable family heirlooms needed to be protected from grasping hands." Tommy's voice carried the precise cadence of adult words he'd memorized, but didn't fully understand. "Then she said something to Mom about how theft charges would teach certain people humility." The calculated cruelty of Gloria's plan became clearer with each detail Tommy shared. She hadn't just wanted to exclude me from Christmas dinner. She'd wanted to destroy my reputation and possibly send me to jail, all while stealing a family treasure that had never belonged to her. But Grandma, the worst part was watching Dad agree with everything she said. He kept nodding and saying things like, "You're absolutely right, Gloria, and we can't let her get away with this." Tommy's tears began flowing again as he spoke about his father's betrayal, and I felt my heart breaking not just for myself, but for this young boy who was learning too early that adults could be cruel and dishonest. "Tommy, how did you get here?" I asked, suddenly realizing the implications of his presence in my home. If David discovered his son had come to warn me about Gloria's scheme, the consequences could be severe for both of us. Tommy wiped his nose with his sleeve, a gesture so reminiscent of his toddler years that I felt a sharp pang of nostalgia. "I told them I was going sledding at the park, but I rode my bike here instead. Grandma Rose, I couldn't let them do this to you." His courage amazed me. This boy who had been coached to reject me at the door had found the strength to defy the adults in his life and seek justice on his own. "There's more," he continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Gloria has been meeting with some lawyer guy, and I heard her tell Mom that she's going to make sure you never bother this family again." The legal implications sent ice through my veins, but Tommy wasn't finished with his revelations. "And Grandma, she's been taking pictures of things in our house, like she's making some kind of inventory." The scope of Gloria's manipulation was becoming clear. She wasn't just after my music box. She was systematically building a case to isolate me completely from my family while potentially profiting from false claims about other valuable items. The sound of car tires crunching on snow interrupted Tommy's story, and we both froze as we heard doors slamming outside. Through my front window, I could see David's SUV in my driveway, with Sarah climbing out of the passenger seat and scanning my house with frantic eyes. "Tommy!" David's voice boomed across the yard, carrying a mixture of anger and panic that made my grandson flinch against me. "I have to go," Tommy whispered, but I caught his arm gently. "Wait," I said, thinking quickly. "Take this with you." I pressed a small digital camera into his hands, an old one I'd bought years ago to photograph my garden but rarely used anymore. "If you see Gloria's music box again, or if you overhear any more conversations about lawyers or legal papers, try to get pictures or recordings. Can you do that?" Tommy nodded solemnly, tucking the camera into his coat pocket, just as his parents' footsteps approached my front door. The pounding that followed wasn't the polite knock of visitors, but the aggressive hammering of people who felt they had every right to invade my space. When I opened the door, David pushed past me without invitation, his face red with fury and something that looked disturbingly like embarrassment. "Mom, what did you say to Tommy?" David demanded, his voice carrying the same edge I remembered from his teenage years when he'd been caught in lies. Sarah stood behind him in my entryway, her arms crossed and her expression carefully neutral, though I caught her glancing nervously toward the music box on my kitchen table. Tommy appeared between his parents, his young face composed despite the emotional storm swirling around him. "I just wanted to see Grandma Rose on Christmas," he said with the simple honesty that only children possess. "She didn't say anything bad about anyone." David's jaw tightened at his son's words. and I realized that Tommy's visit had disrupted whatever narrative the adults had constructed about my character and motivations. "Tommy, get in the car, now." Sarah's voice was sharp with authority, but as Tommy moved toward the door, he caught my eye and tapped his pocket where the camera was hidden. The small gesture filled me with pride and hope. Despite everything they'd tried to teach him about me, my grandson still knew right from wrong. As my family prepared to leave, taking with them the last connection I had to the people I'd loved most, I realized that Tommy had given me something more valuable than information. He'd given me an ally. The house felt cavernous after they left, filled with echoes of harsh words and the lingering scent of Sarah's expensive perfume. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the music box and trying to process everything that had happened in the past 24 hours. My family had not only excluded me from Christmas, they had become unwitting participants in a scheme to criminalize my existence and steal my most precious possession. The irony wasn't lost on me that the very object meant to symbolize our family's continuity had become the instrument of its destruction. Around 5 p.m., as darkness began settling over the snow-covered landscape, Detective Martinez called with an update that sent my pulse racing. "Mrs. Patterson, I've just finished interviewing Mrs. Whitfield, and there are significant inconsistencies in her story. She claims you stole the music box from her home, but she also admits she's never been to your house. She says the theft occurred at your son's house, but she can't explain how her property ended up there in the first place." His professional tone carried undertones of skepticism that gave me hope. Additionally, when I asked to see documentation proving her ownership, she became evasive and claimed all her papers were in storage due to recent renovation. The detective paused, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. "Mrs. Patterson, I think we need to meet again tomorrow. There's something about this case that doesn't add up, and I have a feeling we're going to discover the truth is very different from what Mrs. Whitfield claims." That evening, as snow continued falling outside my windows, I found myself winding the music box for the first time since Christmas Eve. The familiar melody of Silent Night filled my kitchen, its sweet notes carrying decades of memories that no amount of manipulation could erase. I thought about my mother, who had given me this treasure, along with the responsibility to pass it on to future generations who would cherish and protect it. I thought about my grandmother, who had carried it across an ocean to a new country, believing in the power of family bonds to transcend distance and hardship. Most importantly, I thought about Tommy, risking punishment to stand up for truth and justice with a courage that shamed the adults around him. The music box's melody wound down slowly, its final notes hanging in the air like a promise that some things, truth, love, family loyalty, could survive even the most determined attempts at destruction. As I prepared for bed, I noticed fresh footprints in the snow outside my back door, and when I peered through the curtain, I saw Margaret Chen's light was still on, her silhouette moving purposefully around her kitchen. Something told me that tomorrow would bring revelations that would change everything, and that the battle for my music box had only just begun. Boxing Day dawned clear and cold, with sunlight streaming through my kitchen windows and casting rainbow patterns through the crystal ornaments on my small Christmas tree. I woke with the strange sensation that today would be different, that the oppressive weight of yesterday's accusations would somehow lift and reveal truths I couldn't yet imagine. At 8 a.m. sharp, Detective Martinez called to confirm our meeting, but his voice carried an excitement that hadn't been there the day before. "Mrs. Patterson, I've been doing some research on antique music boxes, and I've discovered some interesting information about authentication and provenance. Would it be possible for an expert to examine your music box this morning?" I agreed immediately, curiosity overriding my nervousness about yet another stranger handling my precious heirloom. "Also," the detective continued, "I'd like Mrs. Chen to be present for this meeting, if she's available. She called me yesterday evening with some information that could be very relevant to this case." Margaret's involvement intrigued me. What could my elderly neighbor possibly know about Gloria's schemes that would interest a police detective? The morning air seemed to vibrate with possibility, as I prepared for what felt like the most important meeting of my life. Margaret arrived at 9:30, carrying a manila folder thick with papers, her usually cheerful face set in lines of grim determination. "Rose, dear, I haven't been entirely honest with you about how much I know regarding this situation, she said, settling into her usual chair and placing the folder carefully on my table next to the music box. My late husband worked in estate law for 45 years, and I've learned to recognize certain patterns when it comes to inheritance fraud. The words inheritance fraud sent a chill through me, suggesting crimes far more serious than simple theft. Margaret opened her folder, revealing copies of legal documents, newspaper clippings, and what appeared to be court records. Yesterday morning, when you mentioned Gloria's name, something nagged at me. I spent Christmas Day researching, and what I found is quite disturbing. She spread several papers across my table, pointing to highlighted sections with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to legal research. Gloria Whitfield has been involved in 3 separate estate disputes over the past 7 years, always claiming ownership of valuable family heirlooms that mysteriously disappeared from the homes of recently deceased relatives. The pattern Margaret described painted a picture of systematic fraud that made my blood run cold and explained Gloria's confident demeanor when dealing with the police. Detective Martinez arrived precisely at 10 o'clock, accompanied by a small, elderly gentleman he introduced as Professor Williams, an expert in antique musical instruments and boxes from the local university. Professor Williams carried a leather case filled with specialized tools, magnifying glasses, and reference books that suggested serious academic credentials. "Mrs. Patterson, I understand you have a 19th century German music box that needs authentication," he said, his voice carrying the precise diction of lifelong scholarship. "These pieces often have maker's marks, serial numbers, and other identifying characteristics that can establish provenance beyond any doubt." As he began his examination, using various magnifiers and small tools to explore every surface of my music box, I felt simultaneously hopeful and terrified. What if his expert analysis somehow supported Gloria's claims? What if decades of family history could be overturned by technical details I'd never understood? Margaret seemed to sense my anxiety and reached over to squeeze my hand as Professor Williams made detailed notes about measurements, construction techniques, and decorative elements that meant nothing to me but clearly held significance for him. The music box seemed to submit to his examination with dignity, as if it too understood that truth was finally being given its due. "Fascinating," Professor Williams murmured, using a jeweler's loupe to examine the base of the music box with intense concentration. "This piece shows clear evidence of extended family ownership, natural wear patterns, careful maintenance, and what appears to be a professional restoration done sometime in the 1970s. He looked up at me with interest. "Mrs. Patterson, do you recall having this piece professionally cleaned or repaired?" I nodded, remembering the Christmas when the melody had begun skipping, and how I'd taken it to a specialty shop downtown to have it serviced. "I have the receipt somewhere in my files," I said, and Professor Williams smiled with satisfaction. "Excellent. Professional restoration work often includes documentation that can be invaluable for provenance purposes." He continued his examination, making detailed sketches and taking photographs with equipment far more sophisticated than Detective Martinez's simple camera. The construction techniques, hardware, and musical movement all align with German craftsmanship from the 1890s, consistent with your family's immigration story. Each technical detail he confirmed felt like a small victory, building a fortress of evidence around my ownership that even Gloria's manipulation couldn't penetrate. However, Professor Williams wasn't finished with his analysis, and his next discovery would prove more valuable than any of us could have anticipated. "Mrs. Patterson, there's something very interesting carved into the base of this music box," Professor Williams said, adjusting his magnifying equipment and beckoning me closer. "Here, beneath the felt padding, there's an inscription that appears to be in German." He gently lifted one corner of the ancient felt, revealing carved letters that I'd never known existed. It says, "For meine geliebte Enkelin, Rosa, Weihnachten 1892. For my beloved granddaughter, Rosa, Christmas, 1892. The words hit me like lightning, confirming not just the date of the music box, but its specific dedication to my great-grandmother Rosa, for whom I'd been named. Detective Martinez leaned in to photograph the inscription, while Professor Williams continued his translation. Below that, there's a signature: Heinrich Zimmermann, Meisterhandwerker. Heinrich Zimmermann, Master Craftsman. The expert's excitement was palpable as he explained the significance of finding a maker's signature. Heinrich Zimmermann was a renowned craftsman in the Black Forest region of Germany. His work is highly collectible, and more importantly, he kept meticulous records of every piece he created. Professor Williams pulled out his smartphone and began making calls to colleagues in Germany, speaking rapidly in fluent German about archival records and craftsman documentation. Within minutes, he had connected with a museum curator who confirmed that Heinrich Zimmermann's workshop records were preserved and accessible, creating an unbreakable chain of provenance that stretched from 19th century Germany to my kitchen table. The revelation of the hidden inscription transformed the entire investigation, but Margaret wasn't finished with her contributions to the case. "Detective Martinez, there's something else I need to show you," she said, pulling additional documents from her folder. "I contacted some former colleagues of my husband's who specialize in estate fraud, and they've been tracking Gloria Whitfield's activities for several years." She spread out what appeared to be private investigator reports, court documents, and correspondence between law enforcement agencies. Gloria operates by befriending wealthy widows and recently married couples, gaining their trust, then claiming ownership of valuable heirlooms through elaborate stories about deceased relatives. The scope of Gloria's criminal enterprise was staggering. She had apparently targeted dozens of families across 3 states, always using the same pattern of manipulation and false documentation. In each case, she creates fake provenance documents, often using the names of real craftsmen and historical dates that seem plausible to victims who don't know how to verify authenticity. Detective Martinez studied the reports with growing amazement, making notes and asking Margaret detailed questions about her research methods. "Mrs. Chen, this information suggests we're dealing with a much larger criminal operation than a simple family dispute. Have you contacted the FBI about these interstate activities?" Margaret's smile carried grim satisfaction as she answered, "Detective, I called them yesterday afternoon. They're very interested in finally building a case against Mrs. Whitfield that will stick." As the enormity of Gloria's crimes became clear, I felt a mixture of vindication and horror that someone so calculating had targeted my family. "Detective, what does this mean for my son and daughter-in-law?" I asked, suddenly worried that David and Sarah might face legal consequences for their unwitting participation in Gloria's scheme. Detective Martinez considered the question carefully before responding. "Mrs. Patterson, from what we've learned today, it appears your family members were manipulated rather than complicit. However, we'll need their cooperation in building a case against Mrs. Whitfield." Professor Williams was still making international calls, his excitement growing with each conversation as German archivists confirmed details about Heinrich Zimmermann's work and the specific commission for Rosa Patterson in 1892. The documentation trail was becoming ironclad, creating a foundation of evidence that would be impossible for Gloria to dispute. Margaret gathered her papers with the satisfaction of someone who had spent decades watching justice prevail in complex legal battles. "Rose, dear, I think it's time we paid a visit to your son's house. Gloria Whitfield is about to discover that some families are stronger than her manipulation, and some grandmothers have more allies than she ever imagined." The drive to David's house felt surreal, with Detective Martinez leading our small convoy while Professor Williams continued making calls from the passenger seat, and Margaret riding with me as I gripped the steering wheel with determination I hadn't felt in months. The music box sat securely in an evidence bag on my back seat, its carved angel finally vindicated after days of being treated as stolen property. As we pulled into David's driveway, I could see several cars already there: Gloria's silver Mercedes, Janet's white SUV, and another vehicle I didn't recognize that Professor Williams identified as belonging to the FBI agents who had arrived ahead of us. The front door of my son's house opened before we could knock, and David appeared with a face pale with shock and confusion. "Mom, what's going on?" he asked, his voice carrying none of yesterday's anger, but instead the bewildered tone of someone whose world had just been turned upside down. Behind him, I could see Gloria seated in the living room, flanked by 2 people in dark suits who had the unmistakable bearing of federal agents. Her perfectly coiffed silver hair and expensive dress seemed incongruous with the handcuffs that secured her wrists to the chair, and her eyes held a fury that would have terrified me 24 hours ago, but now simply looked like the impotent rage of a criminal finally caught in her own web of lies. Detective Martinez took charge of the scene with professional efficiency, explaining to my stunned family that Gloria Whitfield was being arrested on multiple charges of fraud, theft, and racketeering in connection with a multi-state scheme targeting elderly victims and their family heirlooms. Mr. Patterson, we're going to need to search your home for evidence related to Mrs. Whitfield's criminal activities, particularly any items she may have brought here or documentation she may have left behind. David nodded numbly, his eyes moving between Gloria's restrained figure and my face as he struggled to process the reality of how thoroughly he'd been manipulated. Sarah appeared from the kitchen, still wearing her Christmas apron, her face a mask of embarrassment and dawning comprehension. "Rose, I'm so sorry," she whispered, but I could see in her eyes that she was beginning to understand the full scope of what they'd almost allowed to happen to me. Tommy bounded down the stairs, his young face bright with excitement at the drama unfolding in his living room, and when he saw me standing in his doorway with official backup, his grin nearly split his face in half. The boy who had risked everything to bring me crucial information was about to witness justice being served in his own home, and I realized that this Christmas would become the story he'd tell his own grandchildren someday about courage, truth, and standing up for what's right. One of the FBI agents, a professional woman with kind eyes, approached me with what appeared to be Gloria's music box, the counterfeit that had been central to her false claims against me. "Mrs. Patterson, we found this in Mrs. Whitfield's purse, along with forged documentation claiming it belonged to her deceased daughter." The counterfeit was a good copy, but Professor Williams immediately pointed out the differences that any expert would have noticed. Slightly different proportions, machine-cut details instead of hand-carved ones, and most tellingly, a broken angel wing that Tommy had so astutely observed during Christmas Eve dinner. "Mrs. Whitfield has been using this replica to support her false claims while attempting to steal authentic pieces from her victims," the agent explained. "Your grandson's observation about the broken wing was actually a crucial piece of evidence that helped us establish the pattern of her fraud." Tommy's chest puffed with pride at being recognized as a key contributor to solving the case, and I felt a surge of love for this brave boy who had refused to let injustice stand, even when the adults around him had failed to see the truth. Gloria glared at Tommy with undisguised hatred, her mask of grandmotherly charm finally stripped away to reveal the calculating criminal beneath. Her silence spoke volumes about her guilt, as did the stack of forged documents the agents had discovered in her purse, each one designed to support false claims about various antique items she'd targeted in her criminal enterprise. The search of David's house revealed additional evidence of Gloria's manipulation that shocked even the experienced FBI agents. In the guest room where she'd stayed during recent visits, investigators found a detailed notebook containing profiles of my family members, including our financial situations, emotional vulnerabilities, and strategic plans for isolating me from David and Sarah's affections. "She had you all mapped out," Detective Martinez explained to my horrified son, holding up pages of Gloria's handwritten observations about how to exploit family dynamics for criminal gain. "She knew exactly which buttons to push to turn you against your mother." The notebook contained disturbing entries about my daily routines, my financial limitations, and even speculation about my health and longevity, information that suggested she'd been planning this theft for months while pretending to care about family harmony. Janet sat on her living room sofa, tears streaming down her face as she realized how completely she'd been used as a pawn in Gloria's criminal scheme. "She told me Rose was becoming possessive and difficult," Janet whispered to Detective Martinez. "She said excluding her from Christmas dinner would be a kindness, helping her learn to be more independent." The manipulation had been thorough and psychological, designed to make good people feel justified in committing acts of cruelty they would never have considered on their own. As agents continued cataloging evidence, I found myself feeling pity for my family members, who had been as much victims of Gloria's crimes as I had been. Professor Williams approached me with documentation that would ensure my music box's authenticity could never again be questioned. "Mrs. Patterson, The German archives have provided us with Heinrich Zimmermann's original commission records, including detailed drawings and specifications for the music box he created for Rosa Patterson in 1892. He showed me photocopied pages, covered in precise German script and technical drawings that matched my music box perfectly. Additionally, the restoration work you had done in the 1970s was documented by the craftsmen who performed the service, and those records corroborate your continuous ownership. The paper trail was now unbreakable, stretching from 19th century Germany through 4 generations of my family to this moment of vindication in my son's living room. Mrs. Patterson, your music box isn't just a family heirloom. It's a historically significant piece that belongs in your family permanently. No one will ever be able to challenge your ownership again. As Professor Williams spoke, I noticed Gloria's face growing paler with each piece of evidence that destroyed her elaborate fraud. The woman who had tried to steal my most precious possession and destroy my family relationships was finally facing the consequences of her calculated cruelty. Tommy moved closer to me, slipping his small hand into mine as we watched the agents complete their work, and I realized that this ordeal had ultimately strengthened the bonds that really mattered in our family. The formal arrest process took another hour, during which Gloria maintained a sullen silence that spoke louder than any confession could have. As agents led her toward their unmarked car, she finally spoke, turning to look directly at me with eyes full of venom. "You think you've won something, you foolish old woman," she snarled, her cultured facade finally cracking completely. "But you'll still be alone, still be forgotten, still be nothing but a burden to your family." Her words were meant to wound, but they bounced off me harmlessly because I could see the truth in my son's eyes, in Sarah's tears of remorse, and in Tommy's fierce grip on my hand. "Actually, Mrs. Whitfield," Detective Martinez said as he helped her into the federal vehicle, "Mrs. Patterson has demonstrated something you'll never understand. The difference between a family bound by love and people connected only by greed." As the car pulled away, taking Gloria toward a future of legal consequences and prison time, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. The music box in the evidence bag seemed to pulse with vindication, its carved angel finally free to preside over the justice it had helped reveal. The afternoon sun broke through the clouds as we stood in David's driveway, and for the first time in days, I felt genuinely warm despite the December air. David approached me slowly, his face carrying the weight of shame and regret that would take time to fully process. "Mom, I don't know how to apologize for what we put you through," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She convinced us that you were becoming difficult, possessive about family traditions. She made it seem like we were helping everyone by creating some distance." I could see the genuine anguish in my son's eyes as he struggled to understand how completely he'd been manipulated by a master criminal. Sarah joined us, her Christmas apron still tied around her waist, but now wrinkled and stained with tears. "Rose, she told us you'd been talking about changing your will, about leaving everything to charity instead of family. She said you were angry about David remarrying and were planning to punish us financially." The lies were so elaborate and psychologically sophisticated that I felt sick thinking about the months of planning that had gone into isolating me from my family. She played on every fear we had about losing you, about not being good enough, about money and inheritance, David continued. She made cruelty seem like kindness and exclusion seem like tough love. Tommy looked between his parents and me, his young face serious beyond his years. "Dad, Grandma Rose never said mean things about anybody. Gloria was the one who was always talking about money and who deserved what." From the mouths of babes came the wisdom that had eluded the adults, and I realized that Tommy's natural sense of justice had saved us all from a much deeper tragedy. The FBI agents finished their work and prepared to leave, but Agent Sarah Morrison handed me her business card with a request that surprised me. "Mrs. Patterson, we'd like you to consider testifying in Mrs. Whitfield's trial. Your case is likely to be the strongest one we have, given the documentation and the family witnesses." The thought of facing Gloria in court should have frightened me, but instead I felt a surge of determination. How many other elderly people had she victimized? How many other families had she torn apart with her sophisticated manipulation? "Agent Morrison, I'll testify." If it helps prevent her from hurting other families, I'll tell the whole world what she did to us." Detective Martinez shook my hand warmly, his professional demeanor softening into genuine admiration. "Mrs. Patterson, in 20 years of police work, I've rarely seen someone handle false accusations with such dignity and strength. Your family is lucky to have you." As the law enforcement officials departed, leaving us alone to begin rebuilding what Gloria had tried to destroy, I felt a profound sense of completion. The music box was mine beyond any doubt. Gloria was facing justice, and my family was beginning to understand how close they'd come to losing something irreplaceable. The afternoon was fading into evening, but this Christmas story was far from over. Margaret Chen, who had been quietly observing from my car during the dramatic conclusion, approached our small family group with the satisfied expression of someone who had seen justice triumph over manipulation. "Rose, dear, I think it's time we had that Christmas dinner you were meant to have," she said, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "I may have taken the liberty of preparing a few dishes while you were dealing with federal agents and international phone calls." David's face lit up with desperate gratitude at Margaret's suggestion. "Mrs. Chen, could we all go to Mom's house for Christmas dinner? I know it's late, but—" His voice trailed off as he struggled with the enormity of what he was asking for forgiveness. I looked at my son, my daughter-in-law, and my grandson, seeing past their mistakes to the love that had been temporarily obscured by a criminal's manipulation. "David, Sarah, Tommy, you're always welcome at my table. That's what family means." Sarah burst into fresh tears, but these were tears of relief and gratitude rather than shame. Tommy whooped with excitement, already planning how we'd arrange the seating so everyone could fit around my smaller dining room table. As we prepared to caravan to my house, I caught sight of my reflection in David's living room window and barely recognized the confident, vindicated woman looking back at me. The music box incident had stripped away more than just false accusations. It had revealed truths about family, justice, and the power of standing up for what's right that would stay with all of us forever. The impromptu Christmas dinner at my house became a celebration of more than just holiday traditions. It became a restoration of family bonds that had been tested by criminal manipulation, but had ultimately proven unbreakable. Margaret had indeed prepared a feast, somehow producing roasted turkey, mashed potatoes, green bean casserole, and even fresh cranberry sauce while we'd been dealing with FBI agents and international authentication calls. "Margaret, when did you possibly have time to cook all this?" I asked, amazed by the spread covering my kitchen counters. She winked conspiratorially. "Rose, I've been planning this meal since Christmas morning. I had a feeling justice would be served today, and justice deserves a proper feast." Tommy helped set my dining room table, carefully arranging my good china and silver candlesticks with the reverence of someone who finally understood that family traditions weren't just routines, but sacred rituals that connected generations across time. David carved the turkey with shaking hands, still processing the emotional whiplash of the past few days, while Sarah bustled around my kitchen with the nervous energy of someone desperate to make amends through service. The music box sat in its place of honor on my sideboard, finally free from evidence bags and legal scrutiny, its carved angel presiding over our reunion with serene authority. As we gathered around my table, I realized that this Christmas dinner, delayed and hard-won, would be more meaningful than any of the routine celebrations we'd shared in previous years. Before we began eating, I stood up and retrieved the music box from the sideboard, carrying it to the table where my family could see and hear it properly. "Before we say grace," I announced, "I want to wind this up and let it play. This music box has been through quite an adventure over the past few days, and I think it deserves to be heard." The familiar melody of Silent Night filled my dining room, its sweet notes carrying 4 generations of Christmas memories and the promise of many more to come. Tommy's eyes grew wide as he listened, and I could see him connecting this moment to all the stories I'd told him about his great-great-grandmother Rosa and the journey this music box had made from Germany to our table. "Grandma Rose," he said softly, "when I'm grown up and have kids, will you give this to my wife like great-great-grandma Rosa gave it to you?" The question caught me off guard with its implications about family continuity and forgiveness, but I knew exactly how to answer. "Tommy, this music box will stay in our family forever, passed down to people who understand that love and tradition are worth fighting for. David's eyes filled with tears as he understood that despite everything that had happened, I was still planning to include his family in the music box's future legacy. The melody wound down slowly, its final notes hanging in the air like a benediction over our restored family circle. The meal that followed was punctuated by apologies, explanations, and gradually returning laughter as we processed the day's extraordinary events. Sarah kept apologizing for her role in Gloria's manipulation, but I could see that her remorse was genuine and that she was beginning to understand how sophisticated the con had been. Rose, she told me such specific things about your behavior, things that seemed to make sense when she explained them. She said you'd been making critical comments about my cooking, about how I was raising Tommy, about David's business decisions. The lies had been crafted to exploit insecurities that Gloria had carefully identified during her months of observation. She convinced us that you were becoming bitter about David's remarriage, that you resented sharing him with a new family. David added, his voice heavy with self-recrimination. She made it seem like we were protecting everyone's feelings by creating some distance. Margaret, who had been quietly enjoying her vindication, finally spoke up. Gloria Whitfield is a professional manipulator who has destroyed dozens of families with exactly these techniques. The FBI agent told me she has a psychology degree and has been perfecting these methods for decades. Tommy, who had been listening with the fascination children have for dramatic stories, suddenly looked up from his mashed potatoes. Dad, why didn't you just ask Grandma Rose if those things were true? The innocent question hung in the air, highlighting the fundamental breakdown in communication that had made Gloria's manipulation possible. It was a lesson in the importance of direct, honest family communication that none of us would ever forget. As dinner wound down and we moved to my living room for coffee and leftover apple pie, Tommy curled up next to me on my old sofa, the digital camera I'd given him still in his pocket. Grandma Rose, I got some really good pictures and recordings of Gloria talking to that lawyer man, he said quietly, so his parents wouldn't overhear. Want to see them? I was amazed by his resourcefulness and courage, but more importantly, I was proud of his instinctive understanding that truth and justice were worth personal risk. Tommy, those pictures helped save our family, I told him, ruffling his hair affectionately. You were braver than any of the adults, and you did the right thing when it was hard to do. He beamed with pride, then grew serious again. Grandma, are you going to testify in court against Gloria? The question made me think about the months ahead, the legal proceedings that would finally bring justice for Gloria's many victims. Yes, sweetheart, I am. Sometimes grown-ups have to do scary things to protect other people from bad people. Tommy nodded solemnly, then brightened. Can I testify too? I saw her lying and I have pictures. His eagerness to continue fighting for justice touched my heart and made me realize that this ordeal had taught him valuable lessons about moral courage that would serve him throughout his life. The little boy who had been coached to reject me at the door had transformed into a young man who understood the importance of standing up for what's right, regardless of the personal cost. Margaret finally announced that it was time for her to go home, but not before extracting promises from all of us to stay in better communication and never let outside influences divide our family again. Rose, you have my number, and I expect you to use it if anyone ever makes you feel unwelcome or unheard again, she said, giving me a fierce hug that conveyed decades of neighborhood friendship and mutual support. David, Sarah, your mother is a treasure who has been protecting and loving your family for years. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise ever again. Her words carried the authority of someone who had witnessed the entire drama and understood both its stakes and its lessons. As she prepared to leave, she pulled me aside for a private conversation. Rose, the FBI agent gave me some additional information about Gloria's other victims. There's going to be a significant financial settlement from her criminal enterprise, and you're likely to receive compensation for the emotional distress and legal costs you've endured. The prospect of financial compensation hadn't occurred to me, but Margaret's legal background helped her understand the implications better than I could. More importantly, dear, your testimony is going to help put a dangerous criminal behind bars and provide closure for dozens of families she's hurt over the years. As Margaret departed into the snowy evening, I realized that her friendship and support had been every bit as crucial to our family's salvation as Tommy's courage or Professor Williams' expertise. Some angels, I reflected, come disguised as elderly neighbors with keen legal minds and fierce protective instincts. After everyone had gone home and my house was quiet again, I found myself sitting at my kitchen table with the music box, finally able to process everything that had happened since Christmas Eve. The past 3 days had been an emotional marathon that had tested every relationship I valued and challenged my faith in family bonds, justice, and the power of truth to prevail over sophisticated manipulation. The music box seemed to glow in the soft light of my Christmas tree, its carved angel bearing witness to a story of redemption and vindication that neither of us could have predicted when Gloria first set her sights on our family's treasure. I thought about all the previous generations who had protected this heirloom, passing it down through wars, immigration, economic hardship, and family disputes, trusting that future generations would understand its value and continue the tradition. Tomorrow, I would call Professor Williams to arrange proper insurance documentation that would protect the music box from any future challenges to its provenance. I would also begin working with the FBI to prepare for Gloria's trial, joining other victims in ensuring that she could never again manipulate vulnerable families for personal gain. The music box's melody had become the soundtrack to our family's restoration, its sweet notes carrying promises of Christmas celebrations to come, traditions that would continue, and love that had proven stronger than even the most determined criminal manipulation. As I prepared for bed that night, I reflected on the lessons learned during these extraordinary days. Family bonds, I had discovered, were both more fragile and more resilient than I had ever imagined. Fragile enough to be damaged by skilled manipulation, but resilient enough to heal when truth and love were given the chance to prevail. Tommy's courage had reminded me that children often see moral clarity that adults complicate with fear and self-interest, while Margaret's support had shown me the value of friendships that transcend mere neighborly courtesy. David and Sarah's remorse had demonstrated that good people can be led astray by sophisticated psychological manipulation, but that genuine love creates the foundation for forgiveness and restoration. Most importantly, the music box itself had become more than just a family heirloom. It had become a symbol of truth's ultimate victory over deception, of authentic family bonds over manufactured conflict, of the power of standing up for what's right even when the odds seem overwhelming. Winding the music box one final time before sleep, I listened to Silent Night and thought about Christmas miracles, not the flashy, obvious kind that make headlines, but the quiet, profound ones that restore faith, heal relationships, and remind us that justice and love are worth fighting for, no matter how long the battle takes or how steep the odds appear. The weeks that followed brought a steady stream of legal developments, media attention, and family healing that continued the miracle begun on that snowy Christmas Eve. Gloria Whitfield's arrest had apparently triggered a cascade of similar cases across multiple states as other victims found the courage to come forward with their stories of manipulation and theft. Agent Morrison called me regularly with updates on the investigation, and each conversation revealed new depths to Gloria's criminal enterprise. Forged documents, fake genealogies, stolen identities, and a network of accomplices who had helped her target vulnerable families for years. Mrs. Patterson, your case has become the cornerstone of our prosecution, Agent Morrison told me during one of our conversations. The documentation you preserved, combined with your grandson's photographs and testimony, provides the clearest evidence we have of her methods and motivations. The trial was scheduled for March, giving me several months to prepare emotionally for the ordeal of facing Gloria in court and recounting the painful details of how she had nearly destroyed my family. However, I no longer felt afraid of that confrontation. I felt ready to help ensure that no other grandmother would endure what I had experienced, that no other family would be torn apart by such calculating manipulation. David and Sarah made concerted efforts to rebuild our relationship, with weekly dinners, regular phone calls, and a level of attention to my needs and opinions that went far beyond mere guilt-driven overcompensation. They had learned valuable lessons about the importance of direct communication and the dangers of allowing outsiders to interpret family dynamics, lessons that were already improving their marriage and parenting, as well as their relationship with me. Tommy had become something of a hero in his own eyes, proudly telling anyone who would listen about how he had helped catch a bad lady who was trying to steal his grandmother's treasure. The experience had given him a profound understanding of moral courage and family loyalty that would serve him well throughout his life. Sarah surprised me one afternoon by asking if I would teach her some of my traditional recipes and family stories, admitting that Gloria's manipulation had made her afraid to seem too interested in old-fashioned traditions. "Rose, I realize now that I was so worried about being seen as modern and independent that I almost threw away the chance to learn from your wisdom and experience," she said, tears in her eyes. "I want Tommy to grow up knowing where he comes from, understanding the traditions that make our family special." Her request touched me deeply, representing not just reconciliation, but a genuine desire to honor the family bonds that Gloria had tried so hard to destroy. The music box settled into its restored place of honor in my home, but its role had evolved from simple heirloom to symbol of family resilience and the ultimate triumph of truth over deception. Professor Williams had arranged for its story to be documented in an academic paper about the preservation of immigrant cultural artifacts, ensuring that its journey from 19th century Germany to 21st century justice would be remembered by future scholars. Margaret Chen had become not just a neighbor, but a trusted friend whose legal acumen and protective instincts had proven invaluable during our family's crisis. She was helping me organize my other important documents and had become a regular dinner companion who brought intellectual stimulation and emotional support to my increasingly busy social calendar. The FBI had recovered over $200,000 in stolen goods and fraudulent proceeds from Gloria's criminal activities, and I was told that victims would receive substantial compensation for their losses and emotional damages. However, the most valuable recovery had been the restoration of my family relationships and the knowledge that justice would be served for all of Gloria's victims. As spring approached and the trial date grew nearer, I felt a sense of completion and purpose that had been missing from my life for years. Not just the satisfaction of personal vindication, but the knowledge that my experience would help protect other families from similar predators. On a warm afternoon in late February, exactly 2 months after Christmas Eve, Tommy arrived at my house with a school project that made my heart swell with pride and joy. "Grandma Rose, I have to write about a family hero for history class, and I'm writing about you," he announced, settling at my kitchen table with notebooks, pencils, and the same determined expression he'd worn when he came to warn me about Gloria's schemes. "My teacher said I should interview you about what it was like to be brave when everyone thought you were wrong." His questions were thoughtful and mature, demonstrating how much he had grown during our family's ordeal. "Grandma, were you scared when the police came? How did you know you were right when everyone else thought you were wrong? What made you keep fighting, even when it seemed hopeless?" As I answered his questions, I realized that our experience had given him a real-life lesson in justice, courage, and moral clarity that no classroom could provide. "Tommy, the most important thing I learned is that truth doesn't always win quickly, but it always wins eventually if good people are willing to fight for it," I told him. "And sometimes the smallest people, like you, make the biggest difference by having the courage to do what's right." His essay would go on to win first place in the school district competition, but more importantly, it would capture a story of family love, justice, and the power of standing up for truth that would inspire other students and teachers who read it. As I write this conclusion to our extraordinary Christmas story, Gloria Whitfield is serving a 15-year federal prison sentence, having been convicted on 17 counts of fraud, theft, and racketeering. Her criminal enterprise, which had operated for nearly 2 decades, was finally dismantled through the combined efforts of law enforcement, brave victims who testified, and the irrefutable evidence that our case provided. The music box sits on my mantel, its carved angel, watching over a family that has learned valuable lessons about communication, trust, and the importance of never allowing outsiders to define our relationships with each other. Tommy, now 13, winds it up every time he visits, and we listen to Silent Night together while planning future family traditions and sharing stories about the ancestors who preserved this treasure for us to enjoy. David and Sarah have become not just loving family members, but genuine friends who value my opinion, include me in their decision-making, and never take our restored relationship for granted. Margaret Chen continues to be both neighbor and dear friend, and together we've helped several other elderly people in our community avoid various scams and manipulations, using the knowledge we gained from our experience with Gloria to protect others from similar predators. If this story has touched you, if you've ever felt excluded or manipulated by people who should have loved you better, I want you to know that truth and justice are worth fighting for, that family bonds built on genuine love can survive even the most sophisticated attacks, and that sometimes the most unlikely heroes, children, neighbors, elderly professors, appear exactly when they're needed most to ensure that right prevails over wrong and love conquers all.